You are lost in the desert at night. The cold chills you to the bone, and suddenly, you see salvation, a bright campfire in the distance. You run toward it, hoping for warmth and food. But as you get closer, you do not smell roasting meat, you smell the sweet, nauseating stench of rotting flesh masked by cheap perfume. The stranger by the fire sits with his back to you. You look down and freeze in horror. Sticking out from under his robes are not human feet, but huge, filthy donkey hooves. And in his hands, he holds not bread, but a severed human hand with a silver ring on the finger. It is too late to run. The Ghoul knows you are here. The silence that reigned in the center of the Rub ul Khali, the fabled empty quarter, was not merely an absence of noise, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against the eardrums with the weight of deep water, a physical pressure capable of fracturing the sanity of any man foolish enough to face it alone. To Selim, a guide whose face was etched with the cartography of 40 years under the relentless sun, this silence was usually a companion, a familiar void that signaled the peace of the deep desert. However, tonight, the silence was a predator. It had been 12 hours since the catastrophic mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment during the blinding fury of a sudden Shamal sandstorm that had severed him from the safety of the caravan. The wall of red dust had swallowed his charges and his fellow travelers, leaving him isolated in a shifting landscape where the dunes rearranged themselves like the coils of a giant serpent, erasing all landmarks and directions. Now, as the storm died down and the dust settled, Selim found himself adrift in an endless ocean of black dunes, illuminated only by the cold, indifferent gaze of a full moon that washed the world in a spectral silver light. The temperature had plummeted with the setting of the sun, dropping from a blistering heat to a bone-soring chill that penetrated his thick wool robes, but it was not the cold that made his hands tremble as he gripped the reins of his exhausted camel. It was an ancient, visceral dread, a sticky fear that is fed to every Bedouin child along with their mother's milk, a warning that the desert at night does not belong to men. It belongs to the jinn, the smokeless fire, and the things that hunger for the marrow of the living. Selim tried to recite the protective verses of the Quran, his dry lips moving silently, but the words seemed to die in his throat, swallowed by the vastness of the void. His eyes scanned the horizon, desperate for a familiar star or the silhouette of a rock formation, but the landscape was alien, a rolling sea of darkness that offered no comfort. Then, in the distance, nestled in the trough between two massive dunes, a spark ignited. It was faint at first, a mere pinprick of orange against the obsidian backdrop of the night, but it grew steady and brighter campfire. To a man lost in the void, that light was the most beautiful thing in the universe. It promised everything his body screamed for, the warmth of burning acacia wood, the bitter sweetness of hot tea, the safety of human companionship, and the salvation of being found. A rush of adrenaline flooded his system, momentarily driving back the fatigue and the cold. He urged his camel forward, his heart leaping with the prospect of rescue. But as the animal took its first reluctant steps toward the light, a cold sliver of doubt pierced through Selim's relief. He was a son of the desert, raised on the stories of the elders, and he knew that travelers were not the only ones who lit fires in the deep wastes. His grandmother, a woman whose eyes had been milky with cataracts but who saw more than the sighted, had whispered tales of the Nar ul Gulthar fire of the Ghoul. These were false beacons, traps set by shape-shifting horrors to lure the desperate and the lost into their jaws. Rationality warred with instinct in his mind. Logic told him that another caravan might have made camp, or perhaps a group of smugglers was resting for the night. But the folklore of his people screamed that no human would camp in this cursed depression, so far from the trade routes. The fire was too bright, too inviting, burning with a consistency that defied the gusting wind. Yet, as the wind bit into his exposed skin and his stomach cramped with the violent spasms of hunger, the voice of caution grew fainter. The physical need for survival drowned out the spiritual warning. He told himself that he was a grown man, not a child to be frightened by nursery rhymes, and that to stay here was to freeze or die of thirst. With a heavy kick to the ribs of his mount, Selim silenced the whisper of his ancestors and rode toward the flickering orange light, unaware that he was not moving toward salvation, but delivering himself like a meal on a platter to a hunger older than the sands themselves. The transition from the open desert to the perimeter of the encampment was marked not by a fence or a guard, but by a wall of stench so physical it felt like walking into a hanging tapestry of rot. As Selim drew closer to the flickering beacon, the crisp, dry air of the night, usually as pure as distilled water, was suddenly polluted by a complex, nauseating miasma that assaulted his olfactory senses with the violence of a physical blow. It was not the familiar, earthy smell of camel dung or the clean smoke of burning acacia wood. It was a heavy, wet reek reminiscent of a slaughterhouse that had been left to bake under the midday sun for a week. The sharp, coppery tang of old arterial blood hung suspended in the air, thick and metallic, tasting of rusted iron on the back of the tongue. But what made the bile rise in Selim's throat was not the scent of death alone, but the fact that it was intertwined with a sickly sweet, cloying aroma of cheap frankincense and rosewater, a desperate and failing attempt to mask the corruption beneath. It was the smell of a tomb where someone had tried to cover the scent of decomposition with perfume, creating a hybrid stench that was infinitely more disturbing than the smell of the grave alone. In the center of this circle of foul air, a fire crackled with an unnatural vigor, the flames licking high into the night, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to grab at the surrounding dunes. Seated beside the blaze was a solitary figure, their back turned to the approaching traveler, hunched over as if tending to a pot or a spit. A sound drifted from the feria wet, heavy sizzling, like fat dripping onto hot coals accompanied by the popping of grease, a sound that under any other circumstances would have made a starving man's mouth water. However, combined with the charnel house perfume of the air, the sound induced a deep, primal revulsion in the pit of Selim's stomach, a warning signal from his reptilian brain that screamed at him to turn back. He ignored it, laying the blame on his own exhaustion and the delirium of thirst, and urged his mount forward, his hand raised in a gesture of greeting that froze halfway. The camel, a beast of burden known for its stoic endurance and stubborn refusal to be spooked by the natural world, suddenly stiffened as if it had walked into a solid wall. It had caught the scent. A low, gurgling vibration started deep in the animal's long throat, escalating rapidly into a high-pitched, terrifying scream that sounded nothing like the complaints of a tired animal, but rather the death knell of prey realizing it has walked into a lion's den. Before Selim could tighten his grip on the reins, the camel bucked with a violence that defied its anatomy, twisting its body in a spasm of pure, blind terror. Selim was launched from the saddle, flying through the air to land heavily in the soft sand, the breath driven from his lungs in a painful whoosh. He lay there, stunned and gasping, watching with blurred vision as his camel, his only link to civilization and survival, scrambled to its feet and bolted into the suffocating darkness of the empty quarter, running not merely away from the fire, but away from the predator it had sensed waiting within the light. Left alone in the dirt, Selim was now stripped of his elevation and his speed, reduced to a fragile creature of flesh and bone on the ground level. He pushed himself up, spitting sand from his mouth, his body aching from the impact, but his eyes were drawn irresistibly back to the fire. The figure by the flames had not turned around. It had not reacted to the camel's scream, the thud of the rider hitting the ground, or the frantic galloping of the retreating beast. It sat with an eerie, statue-like stillness, wrapped in layers of dark, tattered rags that looked stiff with grime. Slowly, Selim dusted himself off and limped into the ring of firelight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he got closer, he realized the figure was not entirely motionless. The shoulders, broad and hunched high around the neck, were moving with a rhythmic, jerky cadence, twitching and shuddering in a way that suggested an intense, repetitive physical action. It was a movement that looked disturbingly mechanical, accompanied by a wet, tearing sound that was distinct from the crackling of the firewood, a sound of soft resistance giving way, like damp cloth being ripped apart, or perhaps, meat being pulled from the bone. Selim cleared his throat, a small, pathetic sound in the vast silence, hoping to announce his presence and break the spell of dread that had settled over the camp, but the thing by the fire did not stop its work, and the wet tearing sound only grew louder and more frantic. When the creature finally deigned to break its concentration and turn toward the intruder, the movement was not the startled reaction of a man caught unawares, but the slow, fluid rotation of a mechanism that had been waiting for this precise moment. For Selim, the passage of time seemed to seize and curdle, the seconds stretching into hours as the anatomy of the figure was revealed in the flickering, treacherous light of the campfire. The blood drained from his face with such violent rapidity that his vision grayed at the edges, and his heart transformed into a block of frozen lead within his chest, hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. What sat before him was neither man nor woman, nor was it any beast known to the zoology of the natural world. It was a grotesque, blasphemous parody of the human form, a biological mockery stitched together from the spare parts of nightmares. The face that turned to meet his gaze was covered in a thick, patchy mat of coarse hair that failed to hide the sickly, gray skin beneath, skin that looked as though it had been soaking in stagnant water for days. But it was the eyes that froze Selim's soul. They were not the blank, instinctual eyes of a wolf or a hyena, but burned with a terrifying, yellow intelligence, ancient and filled with a sophisticated, sadistic malice that felt older than the sands themselves. The creature's mouth, split too wide across its face, was pulled back in a rigid, fixed grin that displayed rows of teeth filed to needle points, interlocking with the precision of a shark's jaw, designed not for chewing, but for shearing meat from bone. However, the true horror, the detail that shattered Selim's sanity and confirmed the darkest legends of his people, lay not in the face, but in what protruded from beneath the tattered hem of the creature's dark robes. As the thing shifted its weight, the fabric pulled back to reveal its lower limbs, and Selim's eyes were drawn irresistibly downward to the sand. There were no human feet, no toes, no ankles. Instead, the firelight danced upon coarse, shaggy fur that ended in the solid, cloven hooves of a donkey. These were not the hooves of a beast of burden, but massive, cracked appendages of keratin, caked in layers of dried filth and fresh gore, digging into the desert floor with a heavy, unnatural solidity. The sight of those hooves triggered a cascade of ancestral memory in the guide's mind, unlocking the terrifying stories whispered in the safety of the tents: the gull, the shapeshifter, the corpse eater, the demon that wears the skin of men to hunt them. This was no spirit of the wind or smokeless fire. This was a solid, breathing monster, a tangible abomination that occupied physical space and possessed a hunger that could only be sated by biological matter. The realization of what that hunger entailed came a split second later, as Selim's gaze traveled from the hooves back up to the creature's hands. In its long, multi-jointed fingers, tipped with curved, obsidian black claws, it did not hold a leg of mutton or a camel rib. It clutched a human forearm, severed cleanly at the elbow, the skin pale and waxen in the firelight. The hand was still attached, the fingers curled into a rigor mortis claw, and upon one of the dead fingers, a silver-ringed lint-eater detail so mundane and human that it made the bile rise in Selim's throat. The Ghoul had been gnawing on the radius bone, stripping the muscle with the efficiency of a butcher, and dark, viscous fluid dripped from the severed limb, hissing as it hit the hot coals of the fire. The creature, realizing its dinner guest had noticed the main course, let out a sound that was not a roar, but a low, grinding noise, like two heavy millstones crushing grain against each other. It dropped the half-eaten limb into the dust and, with a sudden explosion of kinetic energy that defied the laws of physics, launched itself from a seated position. It did not stand up, it propelled itself forward with the explosive power of a coiled spring, covering the distance between the fire and the terrified man in a single, blurring leap, demonstrating a monstrous speed and strength that no living organism should possess, its hooves kicking up a spray of sand as it closed in to add fresh meat to its larder. Selim threw himself into the embrace of the night with a desperation that bypassed the conscious mind entirely, his body hijacked by a primal, reptilian panic that flooded his veins with adrenaline and turned his muscles into steel springs. He ran blindly into the suffocating blackness of the dunes, his feet scrambling for purchase on the shifting sands that seemed to grab at his ankles like the hands of the dead, trying to drag him down into the earth. Behind him, the silence of the empty quarter was shattered by the terrifying rhythm of the pursuit, the heavy, wet thud of cloven hooves striking the desert floor with the force of pile drivers, accompanied by a rasping, barking breath that sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. This was not the chase of a lion running down a gazelle, a contest of speed and endurance governed by the laws of nature. It was a sadistic game of cat and mouse played by a supernatural entity that seemed to derive a perverse, gastronomic pleasure from the terror of its prey. The Ghoul could have closed the distance in a heartbeat, its limbs built for a speed that mocked human frailty, but it lingered just at the edge of Selim's hearing, hurting him, letting the marinade of fear soak deep into his meat before the final strike. The landscape blurred into a smear of shadow and moonlight as Selim pushed his body beyond its breaking point, his lungs burning as if he were inhaling crushed glass, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that threatened to crack the bone. He did not look back, knowing with a fatal certainty that to gaze upon the monstrosity again would be to freeze in horror and accept his death. Instead, he fixed his eyes on a jagged silhouette rising from the sands ahead, the skeletal remains of a forgotten city, its broken columns and crumbled walls jutting from the dunes like the rotting teeth of a giant skull. With a final, desperate burst of energy, he threw himself into the labyrinth of the ruins, scrambling over piles of ancient masonry and sliding through drifts of sand that had buried the streets centuries ago. He found a narrow fissure between two massive, cyclopean stone slabs, a crack barely wide enough for a jackal, and forced his body into the darkness, scraping the skin from his chest and back as he wedged himself deep into the cold stone, praying to every name of God he knew that the shadows would swallow him whole. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears, a deafening roar that drowned out the world, but then, the footsteps arrived. They were different now, not the thud of hooves on sand, but the sharp, clicking clack-clack-clack of keratin striking ancient pavement. The Ghoul had entered the ruins. It moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, pacing back and forth in front of the stone slabs where Selim lay entombed, its heavy breathing echoing through the narrow alleyways. Selim pressed his hands over his mouth to stifle the scream building in his throat, tears of sheer terror carving tracks through the dust on his face. He could smell the creature now, that same cloying stench of slaughterhouse rot and cheap perfume drifting into his hiding place, closer and more potent than before. The creature stopped, and the clicking ceased, replaced by a sound of wet sniffing, deep inhalations as it tasted the air, savoring the scent of the man hiding mere feet away. Then, the monster began to speak, and this was a horror that eclipsed the violence of the chase. It did not roar or growl. Instead, it opened its throat and produced a sound that was a perfect, terrifying mimicry of human distress. Selim heard the crying of a small child, sobbing for its mother, a sound so pitiful and realistic that it tugged at the deepest instincts of the human heart. Then, their voice shifted, morphing into the pleading, terrified tone of a woman begging for water, and then into the gruff, authoritative shout of a caravan master calling for help. The Ghoul was cycling through its library of stolen voices, the echoes of the victims it had consumed in the past, playing them back like a twisted recording to lure the prey out of its hole. It was a psychological torture designed to exploit compassion and curiosity, a weaponization of humanity against itself. Selim squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling so violently that he feared his bones would rattle against the stone, forcing himself to remember that the thing outside was not a lost child or a dying woman, but a biological machine of death that was currently standing on donkey hooves, licking its needle teeth in anticipation of his mistake. The cacophony of stolen voices, their weeping children, the pleading women, the barking caravan masters abruptly died in the creature's throat, severed as if by a knife, plunging the ruins back into a heavy, suffocating silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Selim, pressed deep into the fissure of the rock, held his breath until his lungs burned, waiting for the inevitable thrust of a claw or the blast of fire that would end his life, but the attack did not come. Instead, the sound of the creature's breathing changed, the rhythmic, predatory rasp shifted into a deep, wet snuffling, the sound of a hound catching a scent that triggered a hunger for more ancient and compelling than the chase of living prey. The Ghoul had stopped pacing in front of Selim's hiding place. It lifted its grotesque, shaggy head to the moon, its nostrils flaring wide as it inhaled the complex currents of the desert night, filtering out the smell of the terrified man's sweat and locking onto a different aroma, something sweeter, muskier, and infinitely more appetizing to its necrophagous palate. With a low, gurgling grunt of anticipation, the monster turned away from the stone crevice, its cloven hooves clicking sharply against the pavement as it moved with a sudden, single-minded purpose toward the edge of the ruins, where the broken columns gave way to the open stillness of the dunes. Driven by a morbid curiosity that overrode his survival instinct, Selim shifted his position by a fraction of an inch, pressing his eye to the rough edge of the crack to peer into the gloom. He watched as the silhouette of the beast moved toward a patch of disturbed earth near the crumbled remnants of an ancient wall, a spot where the sand rose in a slight, unnatural mound. Selim recognized the shape immediately. It was a shallow, hasty grave, likely dug by a passing caravan only a day or two prior to bury a traveler who had succumbed to the heat or illness, marked only by a circle of stones to keep the jackals away. But the stones were no deterrent to the thing that now loomed over them. With a frenzy that spoke of starvation, the Ghoul fell upon the grave, dropping to all fours like a rabid dog. Its long, multi-jointed fingers, tipped with claws as hard as iron, tore into the compacted sand with terrifying violence, sending geysers of dirt and rock flying into the air. It dug with a mechanical, blur-like speed, growling low in its throat, a sound of pure, gluttonous greed that echoed off the stone walls of the dead city. Within moments, the creature struck something solid. The sound of fabric tearing ripped through the silence, the heavy canvas of a burial shroud giving way under the assault. Selim squeezed his eyes shut and clamped his hands over his ears, desperate to block out the reality of what was happening mere yards away, but the acoustics of the ruins were merciless. He could not block out the wet, heavy sound of a body being dragged from its resting place, the dull thud of dead weight hitting the ground, and then, the noise that would haunt his nightmares until his final breath. It was the sound of desecration, the loud, wet snapping of rigor-stiffened joints, the tearing of desiccated muscle, and the sickening, hollow crunch of bone being crushed between powerful jaws. The Ghoul was not merely killing, it was feasting. It ate with a chaotic, slurping intensity, cracking open the long bones to suck out the marrow, consuming the flesh of the dead with a fervor that betrayed its true nature. This was the ultimate revelation that shattered the last of Selim's composure. The Ghoul was not a ghost, a demon, or a trick of the light. It was a biological engine of consumption, a scavenger that occupied a niche in the food chain far above humanity. It did not hunt for sport, it hunted for fuel. As Selim peeked one last time, sickened and trembling, he saw the creature hunched over the tattered remains of the shroud, its muzzle slick with dark fluids, its yellow eyes rolling back in a state of narcotic ecstasy as it gorged itself on the forbidden meat. The sight of the monster cracking a human femur like a dry twig destroyed any lingering hope that this was a nightmare from which he could wake. It was a visceral, tactile reality of blood and bone, proving that the desert did not just hide death, it fed on it. The creature had forgotten the living man hiding in the wall, for the dead were easier to catch and tasted just as sweet, and in its gluttony, it offered Selim a narrow, terrifying window of opportunity to crawl away while the sound of mastication filled the night air. As the first grey streaks of dawn began to bleed into the indigo sky, turning the horizon the color of a bruised plum, the creature paused in its macabre feast, sensing the approach of the sun with the instinctual revulsion of a parasite that can only thrive in the dark. With a final, unsatisfied snarl, the Ghoul abandoned the scattered mosaic of gnawed bones and the shredded burial shroud, retreating into the deepest, darkest bowels of the ruined city, slithering down into the subterranean warrens where the light of Allah never touched. Selim, whose hair had turned the shock white of bleached bone in the span of a single night, waited until the sun was high and the shadows had burned away before daring to uncurl his cramped limbs from the stone crevice. He emerged into the blinding daylight a broken husk of a man, his mind fractured by a horror that the human psyche was never designed to process. He stumbled westward across the burning sands, his feet moving with the mechanical rhythm of the soulless, indifferent to the heat that blistered his skin and the thirst that turned his tongue to sandpaper. He was a ghost walking through a furnace, driven not by the hope of survival, but by a strange, magnetic compulsion to carry a burden he did not yet understand. By the grace of a fate that was cruel rather than kind, he was spotted in the late afternoon by a passing caravan, a long line of camels laden with spices and textiles moving slowly toward the oasis of Luwa. The outriders, seeing the ragged, swaying figure on the horizon, galloped out to meet him, lifting him from the dust with the gentle hands of brothers rescuing one of their own. They poured cool water from goatskin bags into his cracked mouth and pressed sweet dates between his lips, celebrating the act of saving a life in the merciless void. Yet, Selim did not speak, he did not thank them, nor did he weep with relief. He looked at his saviors with eyes that were flat and dead, two black mirrors reflecting the desert but holding no spark of recognition or humanity. The caravan master attributed his catatonic state to the trauma of exposure and the delirium of the sun, unaware that the emptiness in the man's gaze was not an absence of thought, but the presence of a dormant, gestating darkness. They hoisted him onto a spare camel and let him ride in the center of the column, believing they were bringing a survivor back to the world of men, never suspecting that they were transporting a patient zero, a carrier of a spiritual contagion far more virulent than the plague. When night fell and the caravan made camp in the lee of a great dune, the travelers wrapped themselves in their cloaks and fell into the deep, exhausted sleep of the road, secure in the safety of their numbers. But Selim did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the wind whisper secrets that only he could hear, his blood humming with a new, terrifying rhythm. When the moon reached its zenith, casting the dunes in that familiar, spectral silver light, he rose silently from his sleeping mat, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that had replaced his earlier stumbling gait. He did not look back at the sleeping men who had saved him, he simply turned and walked away into the darkness, moving deeper into the wastes until the camp was nothing more than a memory. He found a depression in the sand, far from the trade route but visible enough to be seen by a lost wanderer, and began to gather dried scrub and deadwood with a manic, focused intensity. With flint and steel stolen from the caravan, he struck a spark, nursing the flame until it roared to Lithia bright, inviting beacon in the crushing dark, a false promise of warmth and safety. Selim sat cross-legged beside the fire, staring into the heart of the flames, and as the heat washed over him, the transformation began. He felt a burning itch in his fingertips, and he watched with a detached, clinical fascination as his fingernails blackened and lengthened, curving into hooks of obsidian-hard keratin designed to tear through earth and shroud alike. A sickening, wet cracking sound echoed from his boots as the bones of his feet shattered and reshaped themselves, fusing together, the skin hardening and thickening until his human feet had become the solid, heavy hooves of a donkey. The pain was excruciating, a fire that consumed his nerves, but he did not scream. Instead, a low, grinding growl built in his throat, a sound of hunger and anticipation. He realized then the true nature of the curse. The Ghoul was not merely a beast, but a cycle, a parasitic legacy passed from the eater to the witness. He had inhaled the breath of the monster, he had watched the feast, and now the desert had claimed him as its new instrument. He was no longer Selim the guide, he was the trap, the lighthouse keeper of hell, waiting patiently by his fire for the next lost soul to stumble out of the night, driven by a hunger that would never be satisfied.